Yeah, we are living in times of very deep change, fundamental change. The change is as deep as when we moved from the agricultural age to the industrial age. We're moving towards something new, and it's a change that's very, very difficult to stop. And basically, it's a revolution in communications technology, physical and information. What it means is that we're living in a shrinking world. It's shrinking ecologically. It used to be a well, the water was always clean and there was always as much as we wanted. Now there's less and less, and it's dirtier and dirtier. We have the ecological environment is shrinking. We are shrinking it. And then socially it's shrinking. We are living in a global village with enormous social mobility. The consequences of this are twofold. One is that we live in a new political environment. Yesterday's world, the Westphalian age, when the main political challenges were confrontations between elite states, is not entirely gone, but is largely superseded by other things, because the elite states today are so deeply fused, and the EU is an example of that. As long as the global economy functions and we continue to remain prosperous, this political system will probably continue. But on the other hand, in a shrinking world, we now live in much more intimate contact with the world's poorer societies, and they with us. And of course, they are desperate to improve their living conditions. We also want to try to help improve them, because if not, we face all the negative consequences that there can be: organized crime, disease, terrorism, all these symptoms of this huge global frustration and desperation of the poor. So the big political challenge for us, the primary one, is how do we deal with 60-70% of the world's poorer populations. And the problem that we see is that in some cases the development is very good. In some cases it's incredibly good from a socio-economic point of view. If we think of the rapid transition economies, China, India and so on, hundreds of millions of people that are rising to our economic standards. This of course has ecological problems, because how do you then handle the burden of the ecology, which is another huge problem. But socio-economically it's good. We get more contented, satisfied people. But other parts of the world, there are still parts that are actually getting worse. And the problems there, it looks like we're not going to be able to solve them at their root. And this is a huge challenge. Living in a global world, very finite world, with huge tensions between the rich and poor. The second big challenge that we have in security is that we live in a much more complex security environment. It's no longer just political relationships that matter. It's also, on top of that, or around that, it's our functional security. Making sure that our very advanced post-industrial societies, urbanized societies, also do not collapse because of the vulnerability of our functional and economic base. The economic near meltdown of 1 year ago, the financial crisis, is an example of this kind of crisis, but it could be many others. A breakdown of the information systems would also collapse us. So protecting our functional base is another dimension, a new one. And the third one is the rising ecological crisis. And these three dimensions, the ecological, the functional, and then the political, they interact in incredibly complex ways. And that is a real challenge, because it means that our ability to understand and to foresee what's going to happen and the consequences of certain things happening is getting less and less. So we have to start being able to operate in an environment which is much more complex and uncertain. And that's a huge difficulty. Because we have different types of difficult regions. We have one type of societies where people are not starving to death and they're not facing anarchic, violent dangers every day. So they have a basic living conditions. Most of them are educated, they can read and write, but often where very low unemployment or very poor salaries if you do have a job, very boring jobs, so that you have societies with quite deep frustration. And that could be some of the Arab societies in North Africa and the Middle East. And here there is a positive development, but unless the economies can get going so that you have greater employment and greater standards of living, this frustration will remain. And if the frustration is there, then it could turn against us. Because the alternative message is that the misery or the dissatisfaction there is because of us. we have interfered in their ways of life, and that's one problem. That's of course quite close to Europe, North Africa. But then the other area of very deep crisis, and a different very deep crisis, which is often, say, societal collapse, is in Africa south of Sahara. And some parts, as I said, are doing quite well, but some big parts are doing very, very badly. And we have huge, really collapse of societies with anarchic violence, starvation, hunger, misery, fear. And these problems are quite close to Europe if we look at the migration flows. Significant parts of Africa south of Sahara are now beginning to try to migrate to Europe. So yes, and the other thing is that in this world, in the globalized world, practically all parts of the world are close to us ultimately. Yeah, that is really difficult. This challenge. One could say that we have a kind of there's emerging a kind of a information fatigue. There's just simply so much information. We're constantly confronted with such mostly horrifying scenarios. There is an information fatigue, and what one can say, I mean, it is the task really of a responsibility of a political leader to go beyond opinion polls and winning the next elections, but actually to have a vision and to communicate that vision in a way so that you get legitimacy for what you need to do for it. But that's an easy thing to say and tremendously difficult to do. But this is one of the big challenges we face today, definitely. The other problem is this, we're overwhelmed by possible problems. How do we prioritize? How can we say, well, is pandemic more likely, or serious pandemic more likely than, let's say, a technological breakdown? What should we concentrate our scarce resources on? And it's almost impossible to say what is the more likely or less likely. So there's also psychologically, we're overwhelmed by possible catastrophes.